Raiders has some interesting and really different boss fights compared to the rest of the series, with longer, multi-phase encounters. While I think even the worst fights in this game are solid, I want to go over and rank what I think of every single boss. This list will 1. Be very opinion-filled, and 2. Be very spoiler-filled, so this is your official warning before I get to the rest of the video. That said, let's do the list. At number 5, I have Dessert. Let's start with what I like about the boss. I think it is the best horde attack phase. Every boss has a phase in this game where you're fighting other Salmonids to build up power eggs to be able to attack it back. This boss fight doesn't hold back as much as the other ones do, with a laser beam crossing pretty much the entire stage, changing how you fight against hordes, usually forcing you to jump over it or constantly run circles around the arena, and that makes that part of the fight the most engaging one out of possibly the entire list. The design of most bosses is good in this game, and this one isn't an exception. It's pretty silly, and I like the visuals of it matching the arena. Besides that though, I find the rest of the phases to be a bit more mediocre. The boss on its normal phase has 3 types of attacks. A hammer that is very easy to avoid and then you have to jump over just a single wavebreaker beam, a laser beam that is significantly easier to dodge in this section, and summoning rocks from the ceiling to hit the ground, which primarily happens during phase changes. As it does the attacks, it gets stunned, which at least requires you to hit the hammer for one of them, and then you shoot the belly or the fin. I don't find these attacks all that threatening, especially given this is the 3rd boss in the game, so I felt like it needed to have a bit more challenge at this point. This also might just be a me thing, but I found this to be probably the longest boss fight. It might have to do with the fact that you need to constantly wait for a weak point to show itself when the others have a bit more opportunity to attack it normally. Number 4 is the Salmon Arc. Out of all the bosses, this has been the hardest one to rank and who I have the most to say about. As the final boss, there's a lot more spectacle and phases to this engagement, so I'm going to talk about these in order. The first phase focuses on you surviving as a flood pushes you out of the tower. There's a wide range of attacks from lasers, rocks, and more, with a focus on the splat board. This is a mechanic that has largely not been that utilized in Raiders, and that, along with the visual of this huge boss that you're barely even seeing part of, and the exceptionally animated cutscenes, make this phase the highlight of the boss fight to me. The attacks ramp up in difficulty, and it's incredibly fun to use a new mechanic in interesting ways that test the player. If anything, this is probably my favorite part of any of the boss fights in the entire game. The second phase is a platforming-based escape sequence in the sky where you have to maneuver to a larger platform to start the next phase. During this attack, the Salmon Arc will shoot killer whale beams at you. Depending on the tank you picked, the difficulty of this might be easy if you picked speed, or slightly harder if you picked anything else. The platforming section to me though just doesn't feel that strong. I will most directly draw comparisons to DJ Octavio's Splatoon 1 fight, which I consider to be the best fight in the series. The platforming, while not as large scale, was a lot more varied in using mechanics like the invisible floors, fans, and gushers. This also had a much wider range of attacks used by Octavio against the player, and even more importantly, progressing this fight requires you to shoot some of these attacks back at him, making the entire interaction feel back and forth. The Salmon Arc just lacks that, and it does make up for it in some way by visual spectacle. I mean, the comparison of how these two fights is just clearly better here, but the gameplay aspect is lacking in a noticeable way, and that puts a lot of pressure on the third phase to really help carry it. The next phase is fighting Salmonids to acquire power eggs. And while these do have a fun spawn mechanic where you can shoot to break them before they hatch, which I do find really neat, and it's also cool that this arena later becomes the hideout ship, but that's about all I have to say positive about it. The Salmon Arc has a very minimal impact on this actual part of the phase itself, and fights with rather underwhelming attacks. For a final phase, you team up with Deep Cut in a cool and cinematic gameplay of spinning the joystick to win a drill clash. This last phase is the only time you are attacking the boss with your inputs directly, instead of the drill doing it or just running from it. And I want to give some points again that I do think it's really cool visually, but my issue here is when it comes to a gameplay perspective, there is very little I can give it. If you play this boss just one time when you beat the game, I think your impression of it is going to be pretty high, because it is a great climax for the entire game. But part of a boss fight to me is also the boss fight, and to me, there just wasn't enough back and forth between you and the final boss to make it feel as engaging. I think upon repeat, this boss fight feels a good bit weaker, even if I still don't think it's a bad boss fight. So this is why I ranked it where I did. The other ones that had substantially better gameplay, I just felt needed to go higher. Number 3 is the Pain Course. This boss has become my second favorite visual because, yeah, it's a train, that's amazing. It constantly is moving at high speeds while still being very hittable due to its size, but it makes a lot of its attacks, like the one where it dashes through the screen, very threatening looking. It's not that complicated to fight back though. You can shoot it, and when it shoots minecarts at you, you avoid them and shoot it back at it, which is an engaging way to fight back with the boss, and can help make that phase go a little bit faster, but it's not particularly difficult. It does get an attack later with a bunch of laser beams shooting out of it, which I do think is a highlight, but again, not particularly difficult. That said, for the second boss in the game, I think it is still appropriate, but I do think this boss shines even more in its second phase, especially if you play it again on the harder difficulties. The small size of the arena that you're surrounded in makes it a very clustered fight, which has honestly been my favorite out of any of the Horde phases. The pacing of this fight is also fairly fast, since it's vulnerable for quite a long period of time while moving around, so I find it the best in that regard as well. The unique atmosphere, design of the boss, and back and forth attacks between it and you is overall a very clean designed fight. I don't have much to critique about, other than that other fights just have things a little bit better and the difficulty is a tiny bit underwhelming. I could see myself switching this in the Salmon arc around, but personally this was one that I just really enjoyed to fight no matter how many times I went against it. Number 2, the Flapatizer. Compared to the other two normal bosses that I've talked about, this one is constantly hittable for normal damage outside of when you have to collect Power X for it. So the pacing is largely up to the player. You can play very safe and have a very long fight that people might not enjoy, but what I think is fun about it is that if you're good at the boss fight and have the proper tools equipped for it, you can play it much faster. However, this is something that is much better on repeats later. My biggest issue with this boss is actually that it's the first boss. To me, this is definitely harder than at least the Pain Course, if not even Dessert, and it thrives much more on later repeats where you have more gadgets and movement abilities able to take it down. It's still fine on a first playthrough, don't get me wrong, it's not too overwhelming, but it really shines a lot more when you're rematching it later down the line and have more tools equipped to deal with it. This boss's attacks are very threatening between its tornadoes and its bombs that I think keeps the phase against it relatively engaging, while the amount of cover still gives a way for you to take the fight more slowly if it's overwhelming at first. The Horde phase is probably also just kind of okay. It can sometimes throw a bit of bombs into the arena, but for the most part this is just for you to get used to that this phase exists. It's still a good boss introduction that has a lot of value on replay though, so it goes pretty high. And of course, number 1 you all saw coming is the Small Fry. If it counted, but unfortunately it doesn't, so second plan, Lord Saltinium. I think this is easily the best fight in the game. I'd put a solid gap between it and the others, and it does have an advantage in this regard. Given that you have to be at floor 100 to fight it, the players that are going to be going against it will be pretty stacked, so you can make the boss a lot more stacked as well. And going into this boss fight, that was what I needed. The final boss wasn't really a challenge more than a spectacle, so I didn't really care if this final boss wasn't all that interesting visually. I wanted a challenge, and it does that. But there is one interesting detail really worth pointing out. The intro animation and look of the Salmon does actually resemble the Huge Fry, which to me implies that this is a, well, significantly older one. The Huge Fry in Splatoon 3 was kind of out of nowhere for me, so seeing more about it is honestly really interesting for me. It has the flying behavior similar to the Flapatizer that's vulnerable at all periods of time, now being significantly more risky to try and track down and fight. And all of its attacks have a massive visual spectacle. The multiple tornadoes, quick laser bomb thingies, whatever those are, and the arena collapsing during the Horde phase, though I do think it could have done a little bit more at that phase. But I have to give special props to the very last phase, where it uses an entirely new attack that completely cuts out the sound. And wow, was that cool. I'm ready for a new attack. Run! Yo! So that hit like 90% of the arena. This attack just feels really good to avoid, despite the fact that it's actually not too complicated. It's honestly one that just makes the last phase feel even more special as you fight to take it down. It also has a big focus on aerial movement in combat, since they're often going to be the best way to avoid the boss's attacks. and people who focus on more grounded movements are going to have a bit of a harder time. To me though, I honestly don't have as much to say about this fight. I think it was the perfect challenge that doesn't really have any design problems I can poke at. It was the perfect way to conclude the game and feel that your skills as a player have really evolved, and to me, that earns my #1 spot. Let me know what you think about the bosses, and be sure to subscribe for more Raiders videos. I'll see you all next time.